Okay. Bonjour, bienvenue et bonsoir aussi à ceux qui se joignent un peu partout dans tous les coins du monde. Merci de votre participation. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cette discussion. Je suis honorée d'accueillir mes collègues de plusieurs secteurs d'AMC, d'Affaires mondiales Canada, nos partenaires de Cowater, bien sûr, et tous ceux qui continuent de promouvoir la connexion entre le développement et le commerce. C'est un grand enjeu pour nous ces jours-ci. Moi, je m'appelle Geneviève Brown, je suis la directrice exécutive du financement novateur. Alors, c'est notre programme qui gérait ce projet avec, ça a été un grand honneur, c'est un beau projet. So let me begin by thanking Cowater for organizing today's session and for the steady leadership of the expert deployment mechanism for trade and development since 2018. Excuse me. Your depth of experience and responsiveness has been instrumental in ensuring that this initiative delivers well-targeted and high-quality support to numerous trade partners. I also want to acknowledge, of course, that many of us are gathered here today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This is a reminder of the importance of grounding our work in respect for Indigenous rights, inclusion, and real partnership. And some of you may remember, of course, that this project has done some important work on that front in terms of trade and working with Indigenous people, for which we had a previous event. So, au cours des 8 dernières années, le mécanisme de déploiement d'experts a montré que il est possible de faire ce qu'il est possible de faire lorsque le développement s'aligne de manière réfléchie sur les objectifs économiques et commerciaux du Canada. Plus de 110 activités d'assistance technique ont été menées en Amérique latine et en Asie du Sud-Est, appuyant les gouvernements partenaires à négocier, à mettre en œuvre et à tirer profit d'accords commerciaux inclusifs avec le Canada. Qu'il s'agisse de renforcer les institutions chargées de la politique de la concurrence au Pérou, d'aider les PME du Paraguay et de Colombie à mieux se retrouver sur les marchés d'exportation, ou de développer des capacités d'analyse à long terme au Vietnam. Le déploiement d'experts a prouvé que lorsqu'on aide nos partenaires à renforcer leurs propres institutions, on favorise une prospérité partagée. Et ça, c'était au cœur du projet, dont on est très fiers. In the past year, especially, this model has proven its value. The support provided to ASEAN officials during the ongoing Canada-ASEAN negotiations has been a clear example of how targeted, demand-driven expertise can build confidence around complex and emerging trade issues. La discussion d'aujourd'hui est une occasion de faire le point sur ces expériences, et ce, à un moment où le Canada se concentre de plus en plus sur la diversification commerciale et la résilience économique à long terme. La future compétitivité du Canada repose en partie sur notre capacité à nous positionner stratégiquement dans une économie mondiale en transformation, où la croissance, les chaînes d'approvisionnement et la demande émergente se déplacent de plus en plus vers des régions au-delà de nos marchés traditionnels. The Trade Development Nexus is part of that story, of course, and development programming that strengthens inclusive, rules-based, and sustainable trade systems abroad is not only good development practice, but is also a smart economic strategy. It helps Canada build reliable, mutual beneficial partnerships. It expands pathways for exporters and contributes to a more stable global trading environment. C'est pourquoi les leçons que nous tirons du EDM sont importantes. Le document d'orientation qui sera présenté aujourd'hui nous donnera l'occasion de réfléchir à ce qui a bien fonctionné, aux domaines dans lesquels notre approche peut évoluer et à la manière dont nous pouvons soutenir la conception du futur programme encore plus adapté dans un monde où le commerce, la durabilité, l'égalité entre les sexes et la sécurité économique sont de plus en plus des enjeux interdépendants. I'm very much looking forward to the panel's reflections and to hearing your perspectives during this discussion today. So thank you again to Cowater and to the authors of the brief and for bringing us together for what I know is going to be a very rich discussion. So, je passe la parole maintenant à Nadia.
Merci beaucoup, Geneviève. And thank you very much, Global Affairs Canada, for opening this session and for hosting us today. Good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening for those joining online. My name is Nadia Gesh, and I'm head of programs for North America at Cowater International, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion And really, this discussion, as Geneviève mentioned, is about a question that feels increasingly important today: how trade and development objectives intersect in practice, what works, and how really those two agendas can come together and reinforcing each other instead of falling in different directions. From Cowater's perspective, this event is part of a broader set of conversations that we're hosting to better understand how trade and development objectives meet on the ground. And today, in particular, this discussion is anchored in the experience of the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development, or EDM, which Cowater has been implementing since 2018 with Global Affairs Canada and the Institute of Public Administrations of Canada, IPAC, and with the objective of supporting partner countries during trade negotiations, but also beyond, to help ensure that the trade agreement functions in practice. For those of you who are less familiar with Cowater International, we're a Canadian headquarter international development consultancy. We have 4 decades of experience, global experience, working alongside government, civil society, and private sector to support development outcomes. We've implemented over 5,000 projects in over 100 countries. And trade is actually a core part of our work. Besides EDM, we do implement also a number of similar initiatives with different partners, different donors, and other parts of the world. And together, really, this work has, I think, given us a strong vantage point on how trade-related development assistance work across different contexts. Coming back to EDM, and as this project comes to an end, we wanted to look closely at what the experience tells us. The research that will be discussed today, which was led by Paul Baker and Long Lee, looks across EDM's work in negotiation support, implementation, and engagement with trade support organizations to understand what kind of trade-related assistance programs have been the most useful in practice, what challenges remain, as well as limits. And at the core, really, of this analysis is the relationship between trade and development. Trade obviously can be a driver of growth, but agreements alone are not enough. That impacts depend on institutions, regulatory framework, coordination across ministries, and whether business and communities can actually take advantage of the opportunities created. And this is where we believe development cooperation plays a critical role, supporting implementation, strengthening policies and regulatory capacity, and working alongside partner countries to adapt to economic and social change. And these questions are especially important in today's environment, marked by uncertainty, shifting supply chains, climate pressures, and also resources are tightening, and growing expectations that trade agreements reflect broader strategic priorities. And in this context, we believe that EDM offers useful evidence about what works, where challenges persist, and what may need to evolve if trade-related development is to become and needs to remain relevant and effective. And in a moment, my colleague, Phil Rourke, EDM Project Director, will walk us through the EDM model. This will be followed by discussions around the key findings of the research and a panel conversation that will look beyond EDM itself. Thank you again to Global Affairs Canada for hosting today's event, and thank you to all of you for being part of this discussion. Sure.
Merci, Nadia. Merci, Geneviève. Bienvenue tout le monde. We have a great program for you today. We got something like 220 people online listening to this, so makes me feel a little serious, but I'm going to try to keep it light because really what we want to do is to have a discussion about these issues. So let's get to it. I'll quickly go through the agenda. I'm going to walk you through in sort of general terms what the EDM model looks like. And then Paul and Lon are going to present their paper. That paper will be distributed to everyone in a few weeks. That's on the mailing list and also will be disseminating. It's a public document. We wanted to commission this, as Nadia was saying, to really get out some of the issues, the policy issues that have come out as a result of this experience. After that presentation, we have 2 awesome people as discussants. Alice Tipping, Director of Trade and Development at the International Institute for Sustainable Development for all the Canadians into town. That was actually established by Prime Minister Mulroney in the late 80s. And to my mind, it's one of the, if not the most successful international policy think tank that Canada has ever produced. Amazing group of people there. And Alice, we're very fortunate to have her today to talk from her perspective. She's also implemented a few projects under our sister project at EDM, the Canadian Trade and Investment Facility for Development. She's focused on the fisheries subsidies agreement at the WTO and did some amazing work with the Pacific Island member countries under CTPL. We also have Sasha Silva, and more Canadian content, originally from Ottawa, now in Geneva. He's implemented trade and development projects. He's worked for the UK government as their trade and development person in their mission in Geneva. And he's now Chief of Staff to Pamela Cook-Hamilton, the Executive Director of the International Trade Commission Center in Geneva. So, and then we will wrap it up with my friend and colleague, Don Stephenson, who's our trade and investment advisor at EDM, but also at a lower level, worked as EDM and Chief Trade Commissioner for GAC and Ambassador to the WTO for Canada. He's actually a really great guy with all those titles. I put it that way instead of the other way around. So let's get, finally, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. Did I do everything right, Krista?
Excellent.
All right, here we go. The EDM in 5 easy steps. As been mentioned, it's a 8-year project now that's coming to the end in March, supported by Global Affairs Canada, implemented by Cowater International and the Institute for Public Administration of Canada. It's a demand-driven facility that provides technical assistance to whatever countries deemed priorities on every particular year. We work closely with GAC on both the trade side and development side to determine the country priorities on negotiations, implementation, and benefiting from and adapting to trade agreements. So it's very much helping the developing countries that we're either negotiating or implementing trade agreements with, helping them actually participate and build their own capacity, not only for the negotiations and those agreements, but beyond. There are 3 pillars. You'll hear about them in the presentation. Simplifying, one is on supporting the pre-negotiation and negotiation of trade agreements with Canada. So what we're talking about here is ASEAN, Ecuador FTAs. And so we've done a lot of work there, and you'll hear about it in a moment. The second is on trade agreement implementation. So the key one there was the CPTPP in the Indo-Pacific region, but also some really good FTAs that we have in Latin America, and specifically Colombia, Peru, Panama. We also worked with Uruguay in their pre-negotiation in support of the Mercosur negotiations. And then third, okay, this is great. We're doing all this trade stuff. What about actually putting it into practice and helping civil society groups, private sector groups adapt to these new realities, these new rules? And so the third pillar is focusing very much on benefiting and adapting to trade agreements. So what we're trying to do here, and Paul and Luan came up with a really good way of describing it, a life cycle approach to trade and development with a focus on trade agreements that Canada has with its developing country trading partners. As you see at the top, ultimately what we're talking about is using trade to address the development objectives of poverty reduction and economic development. We have lots, as you can imagine, anybody who's done a development project in the final stages, we have lots of data, but we just wanted to sort of put a few on the table right now. As you can see here, we've done all kinds of technical assistance projects, or TAs that we call them. Largest share focused on implementing trade agreements. It's great to negotiate them, but as they say in development speak, that implementation deficit that developing countries have, if they don't actually take advantage of them, à quoi ça sert? So we did a lot of great work there. Another great focus on ASEAN, again, an objective of not only EDM, but of Canada generally. And then on pillar 3, working with private sector organizations and civil society organizations. And you see not only how many individuals and organizations we supported, but the individuals themselves, and a breakdown in the graph on the right according to country. We got around. We worked with ASEAN, but also Vietnam, Peru, Paraguay, Ecuador, Colombia, and we had and so in Latin America, apart from Ecuador, it was very much focused on really good agreements and how can we make them better? How can we actually help them take advantage of those agreements and build their own capacity? Ecuador and ASEAN was focused on negotiations, and Vietnam was focused on implementation. One of the better success stories there was actually helping them with their intellectual property law. I've done a lot of trade and development projects, and you can give the best advice, but at the end of the day, it's like our government. You give them the advice, it's up to them to figure out if they're actually going to do something with it. In this case, we actually implemented something that was in Canada's interest to see implemented as part of their obligations to the CPTPP, but also something that we wanted to see them implement. So these are all geeky stories if you get into this stuff, but it's actually very significant from my perspective, results across the board. So working with MDAs or ministries, departments, and agencies, regulatory change, really, that's where we see it at the, as we say in development speak, intermediate outcomes, and building the capacity of trade and industry associations. Finally, we were aligned with the Indo-Pacific strategy before it actually started. And so if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, if you look at the results of EDM, you can see that we're doing all kinds of things that are priorities in that strategy. We haven't seen the government's overall global trade diversification strategy, but you can imagine that it'll be similar to this in Latin America. And so we've been doing the same thing in Latin America with the countries that I just mentioned. So very much not only on the short term, but on the long term side of FTA negotiations, taking advantage of the CPTPP and other trade agreements, but also the development aspects of those trade agreements for developing countries. So that's me. I really want to go as quickly as possible to the real smarts in the room or on the internet today. Paul and Luan. Paul and Luan, please.
Thank you very much, Phil. That's quite a tall order that you're putting us in. But yeah, thank you very much for that. Mesdames et messieurs, je vais commencer juste en français. C'est un plaisir d'être parmi vous et de pouvoir partager les résultats de nos travaux sur IDM. Dans l'intérêt de ceux en ligne, je continuerai la présentation en anglais, mais j'espère continuer avec vous les discussions sur les leçons tirées de l'exercice et surtout de réfléchir ensemble sur l'avenir de l'aide au commerce, en particulier sur l'avenir des projets financés par FR Mondial Canada. So thank you very much, Phil, Don, Vicky, for organizing this, and really it's a pleasure to present the findings from our stock-taking exercise of the work of EDM and translating what worked well for future program designs of this kind of nature, but also linking what outcomes were achieved and how this can inform Canada's future ambitions in the trade and development space. So Luan and I started working on this paper towards the end of EDM's life when most of the projects were complete. It's not an evaluation exercise, but very much a stock-taking exercise. And we'll be using, of course, this event then to share these broader results, but also to try and integrate any helpful insights that come out of the webinar and integrate it into the paper as we finalize that paper. Luan and I both work at International Economics. Luan's based in Vietnam, so it's relatively late for her, and I'm based in Mauritius, still relatively late for me as well. Next slide, please. So the idea of the presentation is indeed not to be too long. We're going to try and keep it to around 20 minutes. We'll start with Luan presenting the context and the reasons really for the brief, namely that what is the Global Aid for Trade Initiative and its contribution to development, as well as the evolving nature of aid for trade. Luan will then present some of the interesting results from the case studies, as the broad program indicators have already been presented by Phil, as well as much of the data on those results. We can also get obviously more information in the paper when it comes to the broad results from EDM. Then I'll come back on and I will summarize some of the approaches that were used by EDM and how they might be replicated for future programming. And then I'll finish off by looking ahead at considerations for this future programming by suggesting some options in light of some of the evolving trends in aid for trade. So on that note, I'll pass it on to Luan.
Thank you, Paul, for the introductions. Hello, good morning to you all. As Paul mentioned, I will provide some context as well as the case study that we specifically look at under EDM programs. I guess all of us in the webinar today must be working on either or both sides of trade and development. So at some point we hear some saying that trade has been recognized as an engine for development under Agenda 2030, that trade is a means to the end but not an end itself. And in fact, we can establish several linkages between trade to each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I don't think we will go too much into that. But we can also see that in the past few decades, we see a lot of trade-related technical assistance delivered globally to the developing and least developed countries. And in addition to the primary focus on promoting development goal in the beneficiary countries themselves, we also see a recent trend of emphasizing on secondary benefits, which aim to create the synergy with the interests of businesses in the donor home countries. Another trend is the tightening of aid budget across all donors, which further necessitate the new thinking into the design and delivery of trade-related assistance activity. And against this backdrop, I think the discussion today is very timely, and why our paper focus on Canada, trade and development and EDM work. I think the discussions are hopefully irrelevant and relatable to other programs too. Next slide, please. So at a few mentions, EDM work got 3 key pillars, and we take a case study approach. The first case study is under Pillar 1 negotiations, under which EDM provided 19 interlinked TA to ASEAN member states to support these ongoing ASEAN-Canada FTA negotiations. And these TAs cover a wide range of new and complex issues, such as labor, trade and environment, competitive neutrality, negative list. And this topic, as an ASEAN citizen myself, I must say that they are not familiar to all ASEAN member states. This is important in a sense to have all of the TA to create a regional baseline for trade negotiation with the whole bloc, considering some ASEAN member states have signed more trade agreement with deeper commitment compared to others. And so establishing a baseline is really important. And what would deliver under the 19 TAs, and we look at a select group of that, what was delivered was considered very valuable by regional stakeholders. They said that they appreciate the support to establish a shared baseline across the 10 Asian member states, which allow the negotiation to focus on the substance rather than hovering around the basic concept, and therefore that help accelerate the progress of the negotiations. The stakeholder in the region also appreciate that the neutral and the technically grounded support delivered by independent experts, and the fact that this TA left behind some material for future use. So they have some policy toolkits, some guidelines, some model for them to continue their work in policy making in the future. Next slide, please. Under Pillar 2 implementations, EDM designed a multiple phase support package to have INDECOP, the government agency in charge of merger control in Peru. And so under the chain of TAs, the TA have to set up an entirely new economy-wide merger control system after the new competition law of Peru entered into force in 2021. It should be noted that before 2021, Peru have anti-competitive law, but that only applied to electric city sectors. And so that led most market exposed to potentially anti-competitive consolidations. And therefore, the economy-wide merger control system under the new law mean that there is need for significant improvement in the merger control capacity. And so the TA deliver capacity building on not only the core skill, but also provide hands-on mentoring on real merger file in the countries. So the government official work on the real case when they at the same time receive capacity building under the TAs. And these TAs show very tangible results, whereby, first of all, a whole new core capacity was installed in the government agencies, and the government official now have tool and template readily developed for their future use in the future case. And it is reported that the government also gained confidence because of the gain understanding now that they can handle the future case. And from a development perspective, we can link it to a number of outcomes related to fairer and level playing field. Next slide, please. The third case studies link with both implementation and benefiting adaptation, or we call utilization pillar under PM. Under this TA, EDM have Malaysia identify and adapt an international standard for sustainable mining. The TAs comprise several activities, from a comparative analysis of global mining sustainability framework to multi-stakeholder consultations, and then building governance architecture related to mining, and then study tour for learning. So the results has also been substantial with observed systemic institutional change comprising of a national certification scheme, and then the new sustainability capacity that is installed in the in Malaysia Industry Association, Mining Association, and then we also see the state level policy endorsement for the standard, whereby Sarawak State formally recommended the standard in their mining strategies. And linked to development goal, it can be expected that the implementation of the standard will have strengthened environmental stewardship, community participations, promoting indigenous rights, as well as support Malaysia's shift to higher value and ESG compliant critical mineral value chain, which is a hot topic these days. There is also reported private sector linkages established between Canada and Malaysia following the TAs, and this provides the evidence that meaningful linkages between trade and development initiative on the one side and trade promotion and business partnership instrument on the other side can work together. And this is something that private sector can easily relate and appreciate. Next slide, please. Yes, and overall, linking to the larger trade and development framework with EDM, we look at the distribution of EDM activity, and this distribution show a balance between the traditional interventions like export development and market access with a substantial volume of new and emerging trade-related areas. We know that these new areas now form a substantial level of behind the border discipline that have received increasing interest by both the government and business across the world. If we can go to the next slide, we have the chart to show the distributions, please. And so we can also see in these distributions among the new and emerging issue, trade-related environment and labor issue form a relatively higher number of TA. On the other hand, newer areas such as e-commerce, RBC circularities are there, but have relatively lower numbers. And this may suggest some scope for future growth, as we know that country right now, many countries across the world are looking to deepen the dual transformation, digitalization, and green transitions. And another notable feature of EDM is the dual approach to environmental sustainability and justice, whereby we call the integrated approach, which use environment and justice as a cross-cutting feature across all TA, regardless of the primary subject matter, and then the focus approach, whereby EDM would provide some dedicated TA on the topic. And personally, as someone work under some EDM TA, I must say that this is a way that have to embed systematically environment, sustainability, and justice principle across all TA, and it benefits us as experts as well as the beneficiaries, because this approach forces us to think harder and more holistically about the different angle that trade and development may interact across a wide range of policy measures. Next slide, please. Well, this is a section of pause, so I provide some of the specific observations based on case study that we look at into EDM work. And now over to Paul for a summary of the lesson learned and what we suggest for considerations for future programming. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Luan. I think I'm slowly turning more and more orange. There is a beautiful sunset here. I'm in Mauritius, which is filtering through the window. So don't. Eventually, I'll turn grey again as it gets dark. So yes, so Luan has covered some of the important insights from the support that was given by EDM to ASEAN, Peru, and Malaysia. So I won't go back over these different case studies. So the report has more in-depth analysis, of course, on all these different interventions that EDM have done. Obviously, we didn't cover everything, and so we tried to pick some of the lessons that could be obtained from these different interventions. So Phil mentioned that we use this term life cycle approach, which I think has really been embedded in the approach that EDM has taken. It has sequenced support across these 4 different pillars. So first of all, at the negotiation level, preparing for the negotiations and negotiation level, then implementation of the commitments that have resulted from the concluded FTAs, and then it's about benefiting from the FTAs. It's also anchored its support precisely on these different commitments, on the different FTAs, or on sectors as well. And then it's also built some sort of durable assets, both through the capacity building efforts, but also through what it has left behind in terms of, say, model text agreements, or looking at forms for merger assessments, and other types of guides that are also helpful for the countries to move forward in the future with. Just a couple of words on some of the other projects. So the support for Ecuador and Canada's FTA negotiations focus very much on labor, environment, and indigenous peoples. And it coincided with the negotiations as well as the conclusion of these FTA discussions. The TAAs examined the challenges of addressing Canada's objectives of integrated, robust labor and environmental chapters, as well as inclusive trade, while also safeguarding indigenous obligations under domestic and international laws. So I think, importantly here, it was to create the confidence for the Ecuadorian officials to be able to integrate and adopt these kind of ambitious agreements. In Vietnam and Peru, there was evidence of the benefits of the post-negotiation support by translating those FTA commitments into durable capabilities for different relevant agencies in those partner countries, as well as trying to address some of the challenges for businesses. Luan has already spoken about Peru, but in the case of Vietnam, for example, the IP office was provided with support to implement the new IPR commitments under the CPTPP, such as on South Mark registration, also strengthening enforcement at the border, as well as capacitating businesses to register and enforce trademarks in some of the key CPTPP markets. So I think that was quite an achievement. In Paraguay, EDM demonstrated that trade and development interventions can strengthen that last mile of export readiness for MSMEs and improve the country's ability to generate usable market intelligence. For the nexus between indigenous peoples and trade, EDM's Ecuador project showed that a well-designed TAA can reframe how partners see indigenous rights within the FTA negotiations, as well as to how that would play out in terms of the implementation. And in the case that Luan presented on Malaysia, it also illustrated how a carefully designed country-led adaptation of a Canadian ESG standard could not only advance the goals for the country, the partner country, in building sustainable mining, developing the community, as well as upholding indigenous standards, but it also plays quite well into Canada's own critical mineral and diversification strategies, while also offering a scalable model to use for other similar Indo-Pacific partners. Next slide, please. So taking all this EDM experience into account, as well as, of course, we have both quite a lot of extensive experience in other Aid for Trade programs too. This slide is really about how to think about the future trade-related programming so that it can support both the country's needs, but also Canada's own trade objectives. So we often refer to these as the secondary benefits. We have an arrow here pointing in one direction, which is intentional. It's showing the progression from capacity building to improving the benefits and conditions on the ground, as well as leading to more credible and robust and resilient trade agreements for the future. But of course, there will be some feedback loops between these different processes, so we can revise and revisit sometimes the agreements, or of course, as we get further down the line in the arrow, then we might also want to revisit some of the capacity building initiatives too, and the implementation aspects of the agreement. So just very quickly, in terms of the first box, what we start is with this partner capacity building program for its institutions. We look at trade-related development initiatives that can strengthen those institutions and make trade and investment work in practice. So here we might want to focus, for example, on regulatory agencies and building their capacity, or the customs and border agencies, which we know is where many of the bottlenecks are with regards to trading goods. The standards setting bodies, and I think there was a question in the chat actually with regard to how can we help better capacitate the private sector to be able to meet the standards in advanced markets, the transparency mechanisms, and also building this dispute resolution mechanisms that are needed, the safety valves of the agreement so that they can be used. When the governance framework is stronger and the rules can be applied more consistently, then that can achieve more inclusive growth. So the benefits don't just accrue to a small set of firms or larger firms in the region, but more broadly can be benefiting the whole economy. In this second box, we are translating this capacity into tangible secondary benefits for both Canada, but also benefiting the partner country. So obviously clearer rules, stronger institutions, reduced regulatory risks, improving anti-corruption measures, improving transparency. All of this will lead to more predictable business environments for Canadian businesses. It will also obviously help to facilitate investments, leading to obviously fewer surprises, fewer delays, and hopefully lower compliance cost as well. And over time, of course, that opens expanded market opportunities, but also the route for joint ventures, for example, and longer-term commercial benefits between the two parties. And then lastly, enabling parties, or the partner country, to absorb higher standards will create more credible, sustainable, and balanced outcomes from the FTAs, making them more, again, sustainable. And the point here is that the more the partners can absorb and implement the higher standards, whether it's on labor, environmental, competition policy areas, maybe intellectual property, procurement, or other types of related rules, then it becomes also easier for Canada to not only conclude the agreement, but also benefit from the agreement as well. So if we could try and address these early on in the negotiations, where we can already anticipate some of the implementation risks, build a better monitoring and evaluation framework, having the committees discuss what might be some of the challenges in implementation once the FTA is concluded, then that can, of course, be embedded in the programming of programs like EDM, and then build that readiness and enforcement capacity to reduce the conflicts later on. Next slide, please. And you'll be happy to know this is my last slide. So what we really can conclude from all of this, when we're trying to consider the future options for Canada, and in light, of course, of the strategy for diversification. Of course, the priority for diversification has been there for a long time. I was surprised how long it's already been on the radar for Canada, but I guess this last year has tested that need even more. But also we, of course, need to link any future programming to the Indo-Pacific strategy. So where are some of the growth poles that will also benefit Canada as well? And still, of course, upholding the inclusiveness principles of Canada. And ensuring then under this ODA Act that has been adopted by Canada, ensuring still that we retain a focus on poverty reduction, alignment to international human rights standards, and reflect Canadian values, which of course is a catch-all dimension. So I think designing a program around this life cycle approach aligns very much with this twin objective of reducing dependence on aid and using trade as a vehicle to promote growth, and reduce the inequities and equalities in a country, and also maybe some of the environmental pressures that will continue to be arising in global trade. We can treat also TAAs as diplomatic and communication tools. I think that wasn't necessarily sufficiently embedded in EDM in the past. So the missions in the different countries can also broadcast and be more embedded perhaps in the delivery of some of these different activities. But it's also a very good signal for partnerships. We know that other aid for trade donors very much use aid for trade as a lever to get access to speaking to the right people in government, but it's also an important lever for business missions as well, going in both directions as well. And so that can also be prioritized. Prioritizing investments in durable assets for institutions. So we mentioned what some of those are already. In a more simple level as well, we can have on-the-job training, hands-on support, and not just one-off workshops. Too often in technical assistance, we tend to deliver the project and then we leave and we move on. And then the country also moves on as well. So having a longer term, I think, vision of future interventions to follow up is important for sustainability. We also suggested something like looking at blended learning instruments. So things like trade clinics, whereby countries can get access to TA on an ad hoc, simplified demand over a longer time span again. So when problems arise for businesses, they have somebody to turn to, can also be quite helpful in moving forward. Under the Jesse lens, this is all about, of course, making inclusion at the core of the design stage of the project, and ensuring that it is not just an add-on. It was a very nice feature, but I'm sure it happens with all Canadian projects, but we all, as consultants for EDM, had to go through the GBA Plus certification. But that was actually quite a good exercise because we're all aligned in terms of what is expected in terms of embedding Jesse into the programs, and that doesn't exist. I can tell you from all the other donors I work with, that doesn't exist with other donors. So in the future, of course, I think building inclusion into the objectives, the activities, but also the measurement framework is important. So we want to identify who is going to be reached through the program, who is going to benefit, but who also might be left out from it, and also then track some of these results, which was done as well under EDM. Explicitly building on this GBA Plus and the broader inclusive trade approaches, we can also use these as practical tools for program design, also engaging partners and in this tracking and monitoring aspects needed. And then, of course, strengthening the institutions. So the institutional ecosystem that provides for inclusive trade is also going to be important. So it's not just working with the Ministry of Trade or the key ministry that we're working with, but all the other important stakeholders such as business associations, women's economic empowerment associations, and other civil society, and ensuring that they're also part of this process so that that will filter through as well and put pressure perhaps and ensuring that this agenda is included in the future. And just finally as well, ensuring that we also have the data systems in the countries needed to track these things. And we could help perhaps the countries, some countries have a ministry of gender, for example, or women's issues. But we may want to help countries as well with their own M&E frameworks in this area. And then finally, on the last area, which is on the environment. So the environmental lens is again trying to focus on explicit outcomes that can come out of the interventions. So again, making environment trade results more visible in our logical framework models. So ensuring that it's again a feature as opposed to an add-on. Clearly showing what kind of environmental outcomes we can expect or not expect, or what might be some of the risks that we might be doing in promoting something. I don't think there are that many, negatives, but we never know. There may be some externalities. Perhaps prioritizing the implementation of environmental related provisions in the FTAs. This is clearly something that Canada has a comparative advantage on. So does, say, the EU, and other donors don't. And so again, maybe strengthen that delivery on operationalizing the commitments made around environmental provisions of FTAs. And just to say as an aside, a lot of the work that we did was also bringing, EDM did, and I did a very small fraction of it. But what we saw is when we were bringing into the room all these different ministries and just getting them to talk together, to think through things through on the implementation side, what it means, that alone was quite an achievement and quite practical results, I think, in going forward. So it's not just the knowledge, but it's actually bringing people together and facilitating those discussions is important. And then very finally, this last bullet was about the climate trade nexus. So supporting maybe climate resilient value chains in the future. We know this is not going to go away. Also trying to reduce climate trade disruptions. So considering how we might try and focus as well the attention of countries and the cooperation to ensure that trade between Canada and the partner country won't be impacted by any climate change events. So thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to the next sessions. Over to you, Phil.
Paul, Luann, thanks very much. Excellent presentation. Lots to think about. We got the chat going already, lots of questions. But before we go there, I have a few questions for the panelists and the authors. So we're going to do two sets of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. So question number one. The EU Global Gateway Program and the proposed UK Trade Centre Expertise project are examples of donors making explicit links between their own trade objectives and development in the recipient countries. What aspects of these models and why should Canadian policymakers consider in any future trade and development programming? Or do you have other examples or experiences of models to share to inform a future model for Canadian trade and development programming? If I may, Alice, can you start us off?
Sure thing, Phil. And thank you very much, everyone. Merci beaucoup à Cowater de m'avoir invité à me joindre à cette discussion. C'est toujours un plaisir, bien sûr, de parler de nos interventions et sur l'impact qu'ils ont eu sur le plan du commerce international avec le soutien du gouvernement du Canada. Et bien que l'ASD est peut-être le think tank canadien, comme tu as dit, Phil, qui a eu le plus de succès sur la politique internationale, il faut que je avoue que je ne suis pas canadienne, je suis néo-zélandaise et j'ai peur d'arriver au bout de mon français. Donc, je vais continuer, si vous me permettez, en anglais. So, thank you very much indeed. I've just explained that although I work for ISD, which is of course based in Winnipeg, I'm not a Canadian, I'm a New Zealander. And at the risk of getting very quickly to the edge of my French, I'm going to continue in English. But thank you, Phil, and thank you to Cowater for the opportunity to join this really interesting discussion. I'm going to talk perhaps under the next question about the impact of some of the projects that we've delivered under the CTIF in particular, and how some of those impacts and benefits accrue not just to the countries where we've worked, but also to Canada and its interests. But let me maybe offer, in response to your question, Phil, some insights from the process, at least from our perspective, of bidding to be one of the providers under the FCDO's Trade Centre of Expertise. And I may not be able to provide a lot of detail on the approach that we were proposing to take to this particular area of work, because the tender process is paused and may well yet be restarted. But let me maybe point to three elements of the design of that particular sort of set of interventions that I thought were interesting from a development programming perspective. And the first element of that essentially was that what the FCDO wanted to do, as we understood it, was to really integrate various different strands of their trade-focused support, right? So they wanted to integrate import facilitation work, export development and export support, policy development at the national level, and the process of rule development and implementation, both at the regional and multilateral levels. And that sort of integration and that demand for integration forced us as bidders and providers to think about how we were going to structure and how we were going to coordinate interventions at different levels to be most helpful. And I think one of the key elements when looking at the connection between the rulemaking and negotiation and implementation, this is what Paul was talking about, is the need not just for capacity building amongst particular parts of a government, but also building the capacity for them to work in a more coordinated way. And sometimes that's coordination mechanisms as well as specific substantive technical skills about tariff lines and rules of origin. So the coordination, assistance and coordination, we've found very important. And as Paul has said extremely well, you know, better informed negotiating counterparts makes for more effective and more efficient negotiations that build trust, right? And that move towards better outcomes that would be otherwise possible. That it also, I think, serves to build agreements that stand a better chance of being delivered, right? And agreements that deliver shared prosperity because they're better agreements to start. And I think as Canada thinks about diversification and variable geometry arrangements, the need to build that capacity amongst a wider range of governments, I think, becomes quite salient. You know, the second element that was interesting was how the work was programmed. And the idea was, as we understood it, to combine a planned amount of funding for work at the WTO and policy development in priority countries with a drawdown facility that could be used for projects when opportunities came up. And that we thought was an interesting model because policy work, we all know, can take a lot of time, right? Governments are cautious. Good decisions require solid analysis and they require coordination, all of which takes time. So having the ability to have a long-term investment stream in policy-making processes, be it at the WTO or national levels, is really what can achieve systemic change. But we know the private sector can often move much faster. And so development programming that also had the capacity to swiftly intervene to support market studies where stakeholders needed them, we thought was an interesting combination of long-term policy development plus the ability to respond rapidly when needed. And the third element, and this is the one that I'll stop with, was the interesting combination, again, of funding from a central budget based in London with funding that would come in from posts based on what they needed and what their sense was. And there's always a tricky balance, I think we all know, between having enough central coordination of a development program and having enough devolution, right, into the people on the ground who engage most closely with stakeholders and with the governments. You want to include, or you want to ensure rather, strategic alignment between your projects and what your interventions are so that all of a government's investment is pulling more or less in the same direction. And so that synergies, right, can be seen from the centre and acted on. But you also want to give those closest to the ground and closest to the interventions the agency to be able to direct money where they, from their perspective, think it could be most impactful. And what was interesting about the way that the FCDO, as we understood it, was thinking about their Trade Centre of Expertise was that it combined both of those kinds of programming and both of those sources of funding, the longer term and the more shorter term, the centrally coordinated and the more devolved kinds of funding. So that I thought was an interesting model to put on the table, and happy to come back to questions as the discussion moves along. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Alice. Sasha, please.
There we go. Alors, merci. Et je tiens tout d'abord à remercier Phil de m'avoir permis de participer à cette discussion. Je tiens à préciser, comme l'a indiqué Phil dans son introduction, que même si j'ai beaucoup apprécié mon séjour à Ottawa, chez Lisgar, je reste profondément attaché à Bell's Corners. So, just for the record. Alors, comme les autres, je vais poursuivre un peu en anglais. I mean, Phil, you've asked questions about what kind of considerations we have to look at. So let me maybe step back from the individual examples to think about questions that I think would be interesting from a Canadian point of view. I'll answer these questions as Phil raised, wearing two hats: my old DFID CDO role in Geneva and my current role here at ITC, where we have the EU as our major funder. Of course, I can't speak on behalf of either the UK or the EU on this. But maybe I just want to start by acknowledging the proverbial elephant in the room. I think that we really have to acknowledge that as development professionals, we've all been on a difficult journey, how to make mutual benefit work, both in narrative and in practice, while we can still get out of bed as professionals committed to the letter and spirit of ODA. I will never forget my very first meeting with the then DFID Secretary of State, Priti Patel, following the Brexit vote, who said that from now on, ODA had to be clearly anchored in a secondary benefit, which was new language for me, which is to say that this ODA budget now had to be very clearly focused on what it meant for UK businesses, UK supply chains, and to the average voter who may not necessarily be very well versed in the SDGs or the rules-based system. And it was also in this situation where the whole center of energy was shifting. The parts of government that used to fund this thing that we called aid for trade either didn't exist anymore, or didn't have the budgets, or didn't even call them aid for trade anymore. So let me just kind of lay out, as we've been on the journey with the EU and with the UK in this entire exercise, what for me are some of the really big questions that I have seen them struggling with, and to be honest, that we have been struggling as well from implementation partners. And I made the transition from donor to delivery partner halfway through. I think one really big important consideration of any work in this is, where do you intervene? What are your areas of intervention? What are your sectors? What are your value chains? Because, you know, your partners in Honduras or in Senegal or in Fiji may care. Sorry, I think my camera came off. May care about cassava or mango or textiles, because that's what interventions employ people. There may be political reasons, but your private sector or your minister may care about pharmaceuticals or automobiles. How do you collectively decide between your partners in a demand-driven situation where to focus? And I think this is something that really a lot of donors are still making their way to come to the table with. What are the sectors that are important to us, but that we know have a development impact? I think the second thing, which is really important in any shaping of these programs, is how do you get your domestic players to speak development language and ODA and make that link happen? I mean, it's not just something that's new for us as trade and development people. I think it's new for everyone. Most of your companies, at least the sectors that you want to promote, may not necessarily be interested in the markets that you want to focus on. How do you sensitize them to the realities and opportunities of these markets? And are you, as a donor bureaucracy, ready to do a lot of hand-holding to make that shift happen? I think the third major consideration is really about, how do you link the ecosystems together? If you are, like I suspect you are now, and the folks in the UK and the EU, you're trying to make a development impact with less money. So you cannot escape ecosystems. And I think as aid for trade people, we're used to working with a certain set of people. You know, the Trade Promotion Agency in Senegal, the Minister of Trade, the few companies that, you know, export cocoa or coffee or whatever. But if you're trying to bring a Chamber of Commerce from Edmonton to, with a group of buyers to Fiji, this is a whole different conversation that you have to shepherd. For me, one is the most difficult switches to make is about, how do you make the aid, trade, and investment link work? And I think, I'll be honest, this is, I think, where we all struggle. Ministers obviously want big announceables, but now they're looking at investment impact, and most of us are really not in the investment space. And this is something that requires a whole new language. I think it also requires, and here I have to step back from my current role, a consideration of who are your preferred delivery partners in this new space. We have to, again, you're trying to get the same outcomes or even more with reduced budgets. Who really has sector level expertise, who has links to the private sector, who can speak not just to the Minister of Trade, but also to the Ministry of Planning, to Chambers of Commerce, etc. And let me, I think, close in terms of what folks have to think about going forward is how do you communicate in a whole new environment? I think we're all used as agencies, delivery agencies, and I would say in my past life as donors, in communicating in a certain way. Project outcomes, the handshake photos between the minister and his or her counterpart. In this environment, this kind of piecemeal comms isn't really going to cut it. It requires a lot more collaboration across foreign affairs, trade, and aid comms teams that don't always speak together, plus a communication that is much less about this project in this country and a lot more about what a lot of countries are speaking about, a Team Canada, a Team Europe, a Team Sweden, a Team UK approach. And how do you provide this kind of joint visibility is, I think, something that we're all having to work through. Thanks a lot, Phil.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. Paul, do you want to add anything to this conversation before we go to the second question?
Well, no, thank you. Thanks. I remember with Alice, we were talking about the Center of Excellence. We were actually working together and also with ITC, trying to create a consortium, and we were having these discussions. The fact that the UK has relaunched it so many times also shows you how difficult it is for the UK government to come to an agreement on what they really want to do. You mentioned, sorry, and just maybe, I agree fully with what Sasha is saying and the need to link up with the different agencies need to be able to speak the same language, which they don't, of course. They come from different backgrounds. But it's also the constituents at home. And of course, it's been exacerbated, I think, by the rhetoric from the US. But there is this maybe resentment or lack of clarity in terms of what are the benefits of coming out from aid for trade. And so even with the EU, EU offers GSP and EBA, so there's no expectation of a partner country offering anything to the EU in return, but for developing countries, they offer concessions in their market access. The EU has also asked us, for example, to look at, well, how does the EU benefit? How much does it lose in terms of tariff collection? And then how much does it benefit from these different arrangements? The good news is that we have better data. And so it's very hard when you take the approach that the US has taken, where you just look at trade flows. It sometimes can be quite hard to communicate what are the benefits of bilateral trade with certain countries, particularly when you're offering concessions. But obviously with input-output data, we can be a bit more nuanced and we can go a bit deeper into what can be the benefits of having access to suppliers in different markets, because it builds value addition in other markets for us. So that's just one aspect. I just think you talked about Global Gateway, and I think Global Gateway is indeed a huge shift for the EU. First of all, it's no longer the EU alone proposing projects, looking at technical assistance deliveries. They are now working as Team Europe, so they're bringing in all the member states, but in particular, they're bringing in the private sector into the initiatives too. And so that, again, is not maybe something we had so much of at EDM. We didn't have Canadian private sector directly engaged in and investing in the delivery of the projects. And I just want to give one example of, I think, which showcases how you can get tangible benefits for both parties through a Global Gateway project. Europe has a net zero, so they're trying to reach net zero emissions, and they have a net zero industrial act, which in 2024 came out, and it recognizes that the EU is not capable of being competitive in producing all the components and parts needed for clean tech manufacturing. So they can produce some parts, but certainly not all parts in the value chain. And so what we're doing with the Commission is to look at how they could start nearshoring some of these activities. So they're exploring the different markets with which they have trade agreements that are quite close to the EU. And then we're looking at the potential for supply chain opportunities in these different markets. So with European investment, ideally with joint ventures happening in the ground, but also building the infrastructure through the EU huge apparatus of aid for trade. The idea is to try and create that ecosystem or the environment that Sasha was talking about to get these countries capable of producing clean tech manufacturing. And we are at the starting phase of this, but they are taking it very seriously. In South Africa, it's already happened. And so they've used the trade agreement as a lever for investing, I think it's over 400 million euros into South Africa to not only look at the regulatory framework that needs to change in South Africa so that South Africans can also benefit from this industry that it would emerge, but also looking at how the Europeans can also invest. So there is obviously an interest of the EU to try and take advantage of that. And so this is a huge program that really has a potential of making, I think, a massive change. It's leveraging the agreements that they have and other types of confidence that the EU has in terms of environmental and labor sustainability. And it can benefit, of course, the EU as well in the end. Thanks.
Great examples. I'm now into full-on trade and development policy geekiness now. I have one more question for the panel, and then we'll go right to questions from the floor. This goes a little deeper into what all of you were talking about a bit, which is this increased emphasis on promoting commercial interests of firms and of donor countries is having an impact on how firms and organizations in the development community think about what they offer to donors and how they organize themselves to deliver development programming effectively. What insights can you share on how this increased emphasis on trade and commercial benefits affects how your organization approaches development programming? Sasha, maybe we'll start with you because you started this conversation a bit in question one. You have the floor.
Sure. Thanks so much. Look, I have to acknowledge that as ITC, we're very lucky, and I'm going to try not to get into institutional advertisement, but since we were kind of set up to help countries navigate the GATT 60 years ago. What this has meant is actually that our core work is probably more in demand than ever before. I can tell you, we have a tool that's called Export Potential Map, which helps folks find new markets. And in the last year, I think the number of users of that tool has quadrupled. But look, I think let me start off from Paul's point about the private sector. So here again, knock on wood, we've had a bit of an advantage. We've been working with the private sector in developing countries for 60 years. But honestly, this whole shift has meant our knowledge is really exposed a gap in terms of our knowledge and our links with the private sector in donors countries, which really wasn't at the same level. We knew certain lead firms in the UK and in Canada or in Belgium that bought products from the exporters we worked with. But look, if you ask me, do I know someone within the Chamber of Commerce in The Hague very well? I don't. But I do know someone in Burkina Faso. So I think mapping out the private sector in donor countries and sometimes helping even our donor counterparts within the public sector who may not necessarily even know their private sector as well has been a big learning curve. I can tell you we've just hired someone as a Brussels representative, and she comes from the private sector, and that was a very deliberate choice. I think the second, let me just go to the point I raised on comms. We've had to do a big shift in terms of how we communicate that has required, and I'll be completely frank here, no small amount of soul searching. We're used as a UN agency founded on development raison d'etre to talk very publicly about how we support Senegal's development plan. But I don't think we've ever really had to speak as clearly or as publicly about how we support something at the Global Gateway. And so I think this idea of how do we approach our comms to make sure that our development raison d'etre is still there, but how donors can get as much visibility as possible for the money that they're putting in a context where, of course, ministers are having to fight for every drop of ODA. The other big pivot I think that we've had to make as an organization is upskilling in sectors that development projects generally haven't tread in the past. Look, if you point us in a direction of agricultural value chains and whatnot. I mean, look, we have that expertise. But now we're being asked to work in areas like pharmaceuticals, vehicles, mining. So these are, areas we work in, but it means that our entire approach and our entire narrative about how you create value added in that sector, we've had to really change. And I think just two more quick things in terms of pivots. I talked about the sometimes difficult positions you can get as a delivery partner between where the donor wishes to focus on and where the beneficiary wants to focus on. And to be frank, we've had to manage those discussions. Again, if the EU wants to get into pharmaceuticals and Honduras wants to get into textiles, where do you stand? And in some cases, we've been able to find a happy medium. I can say we're exploring with colleagues at Global Affairs Canada a project in the Caribbean on sargassum. So sometimes it means that the landing places are a little bit unusual. And I think the last thing in terms of pivots is that it means you really have to shift the focus and the modus operandi of your thematic work, especially on things like youth, on gender, on green, on digital. It's great to have very visible brands. It's great to do advocacy work. It's great to focus on the Ambassador Corps in Geneva. But we've really had to shift a lot of those programs so that when Canada or anyone else comes and says, look, I want to do a project in Sierra Leone on youth, and I need to target this and this and this sectors because I have a private sector interest. This is, I think, a shift that we've all had to make. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. Alice, please.
Sure, thanks very much, Phil. Well, let me maybe give you an example of one of the projects that we've delivered under the CTIF that I think speaks to the broader benefits that Canada as a country, right? I mean, as a community and as a member of the international community gets from some of this development funding. And I think I absolutely take Sasha's points that we need to get often better at focusing on what the very direct private sector benefits can be. I also think we shouldn't lose in our communication, particularly to ministers who are meant to have a broad global view of where Canada sits in the world, to not lose in our communication strategy and in our focus the impact that we can have through projects that have a broader impact, right? So let me give you one example. One of the projects that we've just finished delivering, in fact, under the CTIF, is to help Fiji and Papua New Guinea implement the WTO's fisheries subsidies agreement, right? I mean, very technical, very niche. Very technical, very niche, seemingly a very small issue until you realize that 50% of the tuna we catch in the world comes from the Western Central Pacific. And 14% of the tuna we catch in the world comes from the waters around Papua New Guinea, right? And so helping those countries to manage what is essentially a hugely commercially valuable and hugely ecologically important natural resource is a benefit to them, sure, but it's a benefit to the broader world, and that's an investment worth making. So I think those messages need to remain as as part of a values-driven development programming framework, but not to belittle perhaps the elements of communication and the elements of impact that really do roll back to Canada very directly from these sorts of investments, right? So the first point is that Canada makes a real investment, and all credit to it for doing so, a real investment in a rules-based trade system. Now granted, these rules are under considerable challenge at the moment, but Canada spends real money at the WTO with its mission here and in its negotiations and its FTA negotiations. And I still think that the money that's spent supporting the implementation of those trade agreements essentially generates additional return on that investment. This is, I think, the point that Paul was making, but from a different angle. It turns agreements and the investment that's made in those agreements into actual shared prosperity, right? To take the words Krista was started off the session with. And the second point, and it may sound, I know, a little old-fashioned, but I think it's even more relevant now, is that development interventions like this one build one of what is now one of the most precious commodities in international relations, and that's trust. And with trust comes soft power, right? So we had Canada's brand new High Commissioner to Fiji at the workshop that we ran in Suva at the end of this project. And all the diplomats that are in this room know that to be able to demonstrate a tangible contribution to a host government's own priorities in what's a key economic sector for them generates goodwill. And I think that even in a world of very variable geometry, where governments are reconsidering their alliances and who they can trust to stand by commitments and who they can't, for countries like Canada that influence very strongly by persuasion, opportunities to build goodwill and to then turn that into soft power matter, right? And they matter for, they matter even more in a world where you're not sure who you will need to trust next and where you will need to have a good relationship next because your variable geometry has just had to vary, right, from one day to the next. So, at the risk of bringing some of the older arguments for development programming back, I think they still matter. And I think they still matter in a world where we are even more uncertain about where we need and where countries like Canada need to have goodwill and trust and soft power. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alice. Luann, please.
Yes, well, Shasha and Alice says a lot of things. So maybe just to be on that point, I mean, like when we said about commercial benefits of the donor and the beneficiary, based on what we see, it's a matter of, packaging it, and we can always find a point where we can package certain activities to show that they have reinforcing mutual beneficiary to both sides of it. So for example, we do a bit of projects in Asia, in Africa. And so when we do like an assessment of a situational analysis of say in ASEAN, where the reasons are, how readily the reasons are in terms of digital trade connectivity, it actually provides the countries in the beneficiary country some information about the current situation in their countries where they are, but they can also use that as normally it will come with something like an action plan where they can use that, repackage it as a kind of an investment proposal that they can either can be used internally in their countries, to upgrade their certain ranking from here to there. Like Vietnam aim to jump 10 points in, say, the cybersecurity index. So we use that, and then we know where we are weak at, and then we improve. They can use that as a investment proposal to the donor. On the other hand, the donor that doing the work, the packagings, and here it require a little bit of thinking and also maybe creativity. But when we do that situational analysis, then we can look at, so for example, if this is the UK's, when we talk about commercial benefit, it may not be too much about good, right? The UK do not have strength in exporting good, but they are very strong in service, so digital service, cybersecurity. And that is where the package here can try to emphasize. So here, even though we are working for the benefit of ASEAN, there are some benefit for the private sector in the UK, because these are the segment of the digital service that UK benefit can actually invest in. And that could be the same for, say, Canada, when you look at certain market here. Similarly, when you look at, in Africa, we do a trade corridor analysis, and we can find like a lot of weaknesses there along the trade corridor, trade facilitation, digital trade, paperless trade, port and everything. So you have the big investment package like infrastructure, but you also have like smaller chewable package like provides a certain software. And so we do not bring in like you have to spend a lot of like billions and billions on the improving the whole African, but you can break it down into the certain chewable size project, and those can be the part where your private sector may have interest in. So the same can be done everywhere. And so come to the point of Paul, Alice, and Shasha say it's a matter of packaging. I think it's a matter of communications. And, in the design, we kind of taking that, the holistic approach to see like, okay, so this is the benefits for the beneficiary countries. This is a benefit for our country. And then just like what we do with JC and environment, we can also incorporate those aspects into like JC, environment, gender, youth, indigenous people. We can incorporate some of those lengths into the design of the project. Of course, it will not benefit some group in the private sector may find that this is not the project for them, but the other group in the private sector might find that is the right fit, and so we cannot satisfy everyone. But I think that we can try to find and design the project where most of the interest of the private sector, and thereby the government may find benefit in.
Thanks very much. There's lots of questions in the chat. I'm trying to bring them down to some manageable, but let me start. I'm going to go first at some of these micro questions, and then there's a question about the policy issues, and we'll go to that after. So first question, and actually one I've been trying to figure out as well, is putting the SMEs together, both in developed and developing countries. So we have a specific focus here in Canada, and other developed countries have the same, on SMEs and exporting and building their capacity and more diversified, not only trade, but people who do trade. And then on the other side, you have the developing countries, also SMEs trying to do the same. How do we put those two together? Second, and I've been trying to figure this out, and you might have some comments. It's a lot of the export stuff that we did, development stuff that we did under EDM, and the projects we're talking about here, is actually would be quite helpful in Canada. You know, at some point, how do you get SMEs thinking about how to export and building up their capacity? All those questions that all those projects that you looked at in EDM and all of those at ITC and so on have been working on. Is there something that we can learn from all of that and putting these SMEs together? I don't know if that's a real question, but I'm trying to put together what the question is here. What have we learned from SME development in developing countries that will also help SME development in donor countries? Sasha, please.
I'll happily kick it off. Thanks, Phil. I mean, those are great ones, definitely in our wheelhouse. Look, let me then add on actually a very important pivot that I think, at least as a delivery partner, we've had to make in this space. Because look, I think we're all used to a certain kind of model when it comes to dealing with SMEs in trade. It's about market intelligence, it's about trade promotion, whatnot. I can tell you on our side, it's meant a huge shift into access to finance and investability, which I know is not actually a proper word, but not just SMEs as exporters, but SMEs as focuses for investment. And how do you make an SME investment ready with obviously a trade angle to it? In a context where, frankly, a lot of aid budgets, whatever's remaining, is going into big investment vehicles with obviously a blended finance and ODA. I mean, there's just a lot of language, I think, that us in the trade world are having to learn that folks who have worked on the MDBs or on the IFI side have been doing for decades. The second, I think, Phil, is this question of ecosystems. I think when you're talking to a minister about impact in SMEs, look, they're happy to work with 20 SMEs in the north of Uganda, but if you can tell them about 400 SMEs in the north of Uganda or in Kampala, their ears prick up. And this, I think, is how do you the kind of scale that you have to achieve at an SME level is now in a very different space. I can also tell you that when we work now with foundations, for example, we're working a lot with MasterCard Foundation. The way that they articulate their ambition on SME impact, the sort of numbers they're looking at, are quite extraordinary. And I think then the last thing I want to mention on this one, Phil, is you're talking about the tools that are useful to the Canadian SME SME sector. And to be honest, this is actually something that we've seen on our side. Again, we've been very focused on SMEs from Honduras to Benin to Fiji. But actually, a lot of the users of our tools and our global public goods are actually in developed countries. Because if you are an SME in Winnipeg and you are looking for new markets, you need the same tools as an SME in Senegal that's looking for new cocoa suppliers. I think this is, again, an interesting question in terms of then what is your business model? If you're ODA funded, Do you start charging folks for things like this? But it's this idea that as international organizations, while we have fundamentally a development raison d'etre, the questions that we are looking at are now things that ministers across the economic divide are looking at as well. Thanks.
Great. Others want to comment? Alice, please.
Sure, thanks, Phil. Maybe to pick up on a point that Sasha was making, because it triggered a thought in my head. One of the projects that we're looking to start with a partner in India is looking at the particular challenges that SMEs or medium and small and medium enterprises in India may have if they're part of value chains that export into the EU with respect to the EU's border carbon adjustment mechanism, right? And because I think there's a certain number of challenges that affect large businesses exporting some of the very large heavy industrial products that are going to be affected by CBAM. But as border carbon adjustments multiply across the world, we're going to see a much larger number of companies affected, and as they expand into some more sort of smaller products rather than just hot rolled steel, we're going to see much smaller businesses affected as well. And it just strikes me, sort of thinking about Sasha's point, that as we run that project and learn about the particular challenges SMEs in India may have in collecting the information they need to get their goods into the EU market now, many of those lessons and many of those challenges may well apply to SMEs in other countries, right? May well apply to SMEs trying to export particular finished products into the EU, where they now have to report the carbon emissions embedded in those products. So I think it may, and this is perhaps what Sasha's pointing to as well, it may increasingly require us, as we look at the development side and what we're learning from development projects, to start to apply those lessons back home as well, right? And to work out what lessons we learn that are relevant for our domestic constituents and build into projects the ability to bring some of those lessons in and test them again. So just an additional example of what I think Sasha's thinking about, one of the things.
Great. Actually, can I build on that a little bit? There's a question here about trade agreements and are they the focal point of programming? Don, I remember when you were saying that you were when you were chief negotiator for Canada with India, you would go and talk about trade negotiations with them, but there were also all kinds of other agreements around trade negotiations, whether it was India or somewhere else. And so, Alice, to your point, if there's future programming, should it just look at trade agreements? So should it look at economic partnership agreements and these other kinds of agreements that donors or developed countries sign, sometimes because we can't get at the real market access issues, but also it's related to trying to at least start on economic partnership and see if you get into trade later on. Those groups of agreements that are more about political engagement and about forward-looking when the developing countries have more of a capacity to trade rather than wanting to open up their markets more. So it was something we actually thought about in EDM. We already had too much demand, so we couldn't think about these other agreements. Or joint statements between the countries. And trying to look at the priorities there and how development assistance can support the economic development objectives in those joint statements. Alice, maybe if I could go to you just to expand on that.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think, before I came into the kind of research policy advice job, I was a government official and a diplomat for New Zealand. And I think we all need to be a bit careful with sort of which statements are just statements and whether we really want to get into the game of trying to shape political statements too much, or whether we focus on cooperation arrangements, right, whatever you want to call them, but those that will actually shift something, will either shift policy or will shift market opportunities. And one thing that, looking at my own programming, I have to say, it has been a blind spot for me, but one that we're looking at now, is that we've done a lot of work on formal trade agreements, right, sort of the WTO and free trade agreements, and we've done an increasing amount of work at national level policy making. But what we see emerging now is a world of clubs, basically, right? Clubs between countries where they agree on to coordinate policy or to open particular parts of markets or align on standards or invest together in something. And the question for us, I think, is how do we help developing countries think through which clubs to join, which clubs make sense, with whom, and on what topics? And that's a question for developed countries as well, right? I think this is, in my reading, one of the parts of the variable geometry that Prime Minister Carney was talking about. What clubs does it make sense? What clubs make sense now, on what topics, and for what objectives? And that sits somewhere in between formal trade agreements and national policy making, but I think we're increasingly going to see this soft kind of coordination. And where that soft coordination has a real economic impact, that's where I'd be leaning in.
Thank you. Paul and then Sasha.
Yeah, not just maybe in the area of well, first of all, in the area of CRM, of course, we are seeing a lot of activity outside of trade agreements that's taking place to try and secure access to critical raw materials, particularly as as the drive is moving towards more electronics industries. So I think that's one area where the donor countries are more dependent on some of the developing countries, and where perhaps as well it's an opportunity for developing countries to try and leverage more their own power. But just to give an example where side agreements I think have worked very well, and I think I shared it with you before, but the EU and Singapore, before signing a digital partnership agreement, they first signed a principles agreement. So just that they both agreed on what would be the core principles around securing digital trade between the two countries. And that was a stepping stone to building some pilot projects between the two parties, and pilot programs and exploring how it might work. And then eventually they actually were confident enough to sign a digital partnership agreement. And the EU is now exploring exactly the same model with ASEAN, because, well, first of all, the ASEAN talks are going to take a very long time, if ever they do get concluded for an FTA. So they're moving towards trying to create just a digital chapter to try and move quicker. But then before being able to sign a trade agreement with all 11 countries now, which would be very ambitious, they are looking at what are the opportunities to start from something. And based on that something, we can start building the capacity, the understanding, and again, the comfort of countries to move maybe deeper afterwards with the European Union. So I think there is a concrete example where I think it can work. Of course, as Alice says, it could lead to a proliferation of different agreements. Some of them might be conflicting as well. The problem is as well is the attention and resources it takes away from the officials in different countries to manage all these different side agreements, and then do they actually get implemented? But obviously with a country like Singapore, which is not really very developing, it did work very successfully. But just to say the EU is exploring, I think, something similar, and I think that is a good way outside of an FTA as stepping stone agreements to try and move towards something more ambitious in the future. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Sasha, please.
Thanks, Phil. Look, I think you pose a great question, and let me say this with some discomfort in Geneva as the city that sort of grew up around making trade rules. I think obviously trade agreements are important signaling exercises. Ministers love them. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And obviously when you're signing with economies like Vietnam or Singapore that have a very clearly articulated trade strategy, they can make trade happen. I think, though, that once you move beyond what is a very small group of beneficiary countries and you start talking to a much wider group, that logic tends to break down. Phil, Paul and I, we were involved in the Caribbean EU EPA, what was a very sophisticated agreement, I think very forward-looking, came with a lot of money to implement. But what I think we've all realized is that if the private sector on both sides doesn't really care or know about the agreement, it goes nowhere. The trade stays as it is. And I think that, so this is where perhaps I'm a little bit more skeptical about the utility of FTAs, particularly when you're looking at the smaller and less developed edge of the spectrum, which is, of course, the majority of beneficiary countries. And inevitably, this will be on your minister's priority list. So how do you create a package how do you sort of create a TRTA package even when there isn't necessarily that link? One, I think, final point I'll say on this is, again, this comes back to the investment space and language, which those of us who are involved in trade and aid aren't always so familiar with. Because even where you don't have a trade agreement, a lot of times you have an investment promotion agreement that, as a trade side, we may not know in detail. But that actually is the one that has the hooks that the minister and the prime minister on both sides are actually interested in. And so the idea is, how do we make our trade and aid instruments work in that new space? Thanks.
Great. There's another question here about trying to get the information about barriers to Canada and to developed countries. What barriers that SMEs or others in developing countries are facing when they're trying to trade with Canada or Europe or the UK. We all know, I don't think you have to be a Marxist to say that trade agreements work better for large multinational corporations than they do for small business. How do we do you have any examples of, we hear these concerns from businesses in developing countries, and taking those concerns and seeing some kind of change in the developed countries in how they look at the barriers and how they try to facilitate information or market intelligence or whatever it is to actually make that connection. We can talk about getting more business in Canada, whether it's exports to Canada or more exports to developing countries. But it's not just the tariffs, it's all the barriers around that, beyond just all the other business strategy issues. So how do we put those two pieces together? And how do we influence, both in developing countries and in developed countries, changes in practices or regulations that actually facilitate what we're trying to do here? I don't have the answer either. Sasha, please.
Yeah, exactly. Sasha can speak quite a lot about market access barriers and things. So yeah, exactly.
Well, look, I'm happily kick off. I think we should start by recognizing that any time two ministers sit down to negotiate an FTA, they want to do something new and different, right? No one wants to just lock in existing market access. They're always looking for something new and shiny. So I think and again, I mean, let me go back in the midst of time, Phil and Paul. In the Caribbean context, that meant getting the Caribbean to articulate a very clear offensive interest in the creative industries and in areas like IP. So I think, first of all, there is a barrier to get the change in the developed country importing market. You have to get the exporting market to very clearly articulate that offensive interest, which is not always easy, because it sometimes means on the exporting side, I come back to ecosystems. Yes, the cocoa producers have their association. They're very good at advocating, even internationally. They know who their buyers are. But if you're talking about the creative industries, if you're talking about any services sector, building that ecosystem to make sure that that gets advocated in the agreement is a whole different thing. And then I think the second thing that then you have to do is inject that kind of imagination into the discussions of the actual trade agreement. I mean, again, Phil and Paul, the individuals in question. The Caribbean as a group had to articulate in a very new and novel ways provisions into the agreement that could make that market access into the EU work for the creative industries, for services sectors, for entertainers, for chefs, for, I think, even fashion models. I mean, all these sectors for which the Caribbean is internationally and rightfully known. But these are all things I think one has to think about in a very, very deliberate way, because once they're articulated, then they become part of the conversation, and then they become part of the trade-offs in a trade agreement. Otherwise, frankly, the importing market has no incentive to shift. Thanks.
Thank you. Alice, please.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I'm glad Sasha could chip in as I looked for the numbers for the example that I wanted to use. Listen, I wanted to use an example that I will not claim any credit for, but which does give evidence that developed countries listen, right? The developed countries listen to complaints that they get. And as Sasha said, when these are very clearly articulated, they often do respond. And the example I was looking up was the simplification that the EU went through in September on CBAM again, right? So one of these large sort of behemoths of trade regulation that everyone's worried about. And what the EU decided to do, I think in response to concerns it had heard from developing countries, and in particular developing countries with sort of smaller providers of some of the goods that were covered by CBAM, was the compliance costs that this was going to create, even for smaller exporters, right, of small amounts of product, right? You're a small exporter of a steel or aluminium product, you manage to find a buyer, and you manage to get your import into the EU. And what the EU decided to do was to make sure that occasional importers weren't covered by CBAM. So they didn't have to go through the huge process of measuring all of their emissions just for 1 or 2 shipments a year. So essentially the changes from back in September mean that, and I had to look this up, so 90% of importers into the EU of the products covered won't have to pay CBAM fees. But what's interesting is that because of the de minimis rule, so if you export just small amounts, you don't have to pay CBAM fees. What's interesting is that because they've kept the larger exporters or the sort of importers of large quantities covered, they've still managed to cover about 99% of the carbon emissions that they wanted to with CBAM. So they've essentially, by tweaking something very technical, managed to exempt very small shipments rather into the EU, but kept the coverage of the larger shipments that were responsible for most of the emissions, which is what they were worried about. And they've done this, I think, in response to kind of concerns that the measure in its very broad application was just going to be too much of a barrier to small amounts of trade. So, countries do listen, and there are technical fixes that can be done that maintain your competitiveness and your environmental impact, but keep your SMEs in the game. But again, as Sasha says, you need to be able to articulate those problems, and you need to be able to find a creative solution in your trade measure that lets you achieve your objectives while reducing the impact on those you didn't really need to cover in the first place. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one comment about Sasha's point about the Caribbean and trade negotiations. I was working in the Caribbean when Canada was negotiating an FTA with CARICOM. And what are they selling in the Caribbean? Caribbean culture. The world would be a better place if there's more Caribbean culture everywhere in the world. And Canada can't talk about culture because of the way in which we approach it in our trade agreements. And so you have this real disconnect, and it's just a good example of how domestic interests conflict. But you have this disconnect between what other developing countries want to sell and what other developed countries want to buy, and putting those two pieces together in a trade agreement that not only works, but actually can take both sides can take advantage of. Alice, since we have you on, there's a very specific question in the chat about illegal fishing. So perhaps I can ask you that question. I don't know if you've seen it, but it says here, there's a lot of Chinese illegal fishing in Latin America, the Caribbean. Canada has worked consistently in dark vessel detection technology, but more needs to be done. How does a trade agreement help these issues? Or, sorry, a fisheries agreement help these issues?
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think it's probably the ancillary instruments that you build alongside something, right? So, and in fact, what's interesting is that we have now seen a number of trade agreements, CPTPP being one, that have in them obligations on fishery subsidies, right? As usual, you need to find a connection from a trade measure into the change in the sector that you're trying to see. And what we saw in CPTPP was a prohibition on subsidies provided to vessels that had been caught engaged in illegal fishing. Right? It was an idea that emerged in the WTO, took form in the CPTPP, and kind of extra for trade nerds then made its way back into the WTO. A bit of negotiating history. But what could be done, I think, is that once you have in a trade agreement something that refers to businesses and illegal activity, particularly with respect to a natural resource, if there's a technology that one party to that agreement holds, which could well be deployed to the assistance of the other government, that's where your side letter comes in, right? It's a form of cooperation that can be built on the obligation you have in your trade agreement to, again, help all of the parties comply with it, and so that the benefits of the agreement actually begin to accrue. It would make no sense for a Canadian business to hold this technology and not be able to share it with, a government on terms to be agreed, if that's the agreement, but to not be able to share it or not to have a facilitated way of sharing it with a government who wanted to implement an obligation that it had concluded with Canada. So I think the trick really is in finding, firstly, a provision in a trade agreement that links into either a transfer of technology or a business development opportunity, and then to use a side letter to actually help that investment or to help that transfer, that cooperation take place. So I don't know whether that side letter exists, but it's the sort of provision that I would imagine could justify the development of a cooperation program. I'll stop.
Thanks very much, Alice. Don, you've had a few opportunities to brief deputy ministers and ministers on different policy questions. If you and the development ADM got together and said, okay, the minister wants to know what we're going to do next, and you listen to what we've been discussing here, and you have a little bit of experience working on these things, what would you say?
I would say good luck. So there's no way I'm going to be able to capture all of this discussion in a wrap up. I'm hoping somebody has their co-pilot on, and that they'll circulate, an effective synthesis of the discussion. I think Paul and Loanne, I think Alice, Sasha have done an excellent job of answering the question, what are the lessons learned from the EDM? Is it a model that you can build on, particularly in the new policy environment, to achieve your trade and development goals? I think the answer that they have provided is generally yes. It is a strong model on which you can build. I think it demonstrates that negotiation assistance can help move negotiations forward by providing, by deepening understanding of negotiating issues. And if it is at arm's length and neutral, it can build trust in Canada as a negotiating partner. I think the advice is that perhaps it could be more targeted on some of the issues that are blocking negotiations, but principally through knowledge. I think it concludes that the support for implementation assistance is effective and necessary. When a negotiation is over, and I'm a recovering negotiator, I can tell you, when the negotiation is over, it's not over. Most of the work, still remains ahead to get the value, as Alice said, out of the negotiation. You need to provide support for the implementation stage. And in many of the countries with which we've negotiated, they struggle to implement their obligations fully. And some obligations are never implemented, in effect. So that part of the model was also strong and something that can be replicated. The third part of the model, trying to help countries, and now including Canada, to get the benefit of trade agreements is more difficult. It's more complex. The scale of the issue is huge. It's difficult not to, establish programs that try to boil the ocean. And so how do you target? And I think the advice from Paul and Loanne from the discussion today is that that part of the program could be built on in two dimensions. To improve the development outcomes of that kind of programming, the assistance should be longer. It should be a longer term engagement of what Paul and Luann have referred to as the life cycle, and try to maintain the support until the capacity has really been installed in the developing country ministry, agency, trade support organization. And principally through maintaining the support until you get to the on-the-job types of assistance, the mentorship, the internship that helps them apply the training or the tools that we've provided under the program. To strengthen the trade diversification outcomes of the program. The suggestion is that, it could be more targeted on the sectors of export interest on both sides. That's a trade-off. And to find the opportunities where we can provide pole position to Canadian companies in the market through partnerships between agencies. The example that was provided in the case studies, there's an example of the assistance we provided to Malaysia to introduce mining standards. In that technical assistance, we brought Malaysian mining officials to Canada for a study tour to meet their counterparts. And as part of that, they met with a Canadian company, the Neo Performance Materials that are engaged in the rare earth sector, and they are now in an active discussion with Malaysia about their commercial interests. There are real opportunities to find the pole position for Canadian companies in these markets. And engaging the private sector, of course, is critical for development, not just for Canadian commercial interests, but the private sector is where the money is. So if we can engage them, we can make a bigger contribution on the development side. I don't like, I guess it was Sasha first who spoke to the challenge of communicating trade and development issues. I don't like the phrase secondary benefits because it makes something secondary. And I don't think either of those objectives, trade or development, is secondary. I think they're both primary. And I think they are, in policy terms, a Venn diagram. Where they overlap is what we're talking about. And how to make these things work together, work for each other. What are the tools? What are the strategies? What are the modalities of a technical assistance program? It's maybe a non sequitur, but one thing I've never heard before that Sasha said about the modalities for future programming, cost recovery. I kind of suddenly thought, how would you do that in a trade and development program that goes on to try to find the opportunities for companies? Maybe you charge them. In any event, what are the tools that you can use to get the, forgive me, synergy is a word I hate, but that's what we're talking about, out of trade and development. How can we make these things work for each other? I heard lots of interesting suggestions. I hope that you did too. And I hope that the people who actually have to try to figure this out, just to make you feel better, I'll repeat Paul's remark that, the UK have now tried several times. So it isn't easy. If it was easy, I would have done it when I was still working here. I wish you luck because it's important.
Well, thanks, Don. And you reminded me again that I don't hang out with you just because you're a good guy. That was really helpful. I'd really like to thank Paul and Luann. I don't know if we told you, but we got 20 good proposals to write this paper. And we were really happy that you were the ones who we gave the contract to, because you made a real contribution here to the discussion about trade and development and the implications for Canada. Sasha and Alice, once again, I don't even know why I have to argue why you're on the top of the list of people to call, because just a couple few words and it's like, oh yeah, this is why. Thanks very much, and thanks for taking the time, and really appreciate it. I really want to thank also the micro village of Cowater, Vicky, Krista, Don, again, Patrick, Samira, and Nadia. We just have a few weeks left on this, so let's make the best of it and have some fun. And I think this was some geeky fun, but hopefully everybody enjoyed it. And Geneviève, thanks for inviting us to deliver this webinar today. And thanks to everyone online. We didn't get to all of your questions, but maybe there'll be another. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day wherever you are.
Thanks.